Picture the surface of the United Arab Emirates, the image the world knows so well. Dancing fountains erupting from artificial lakes, turquoise swimming pools glittering on the rooftops of skyscrapers, emerald golf courses rolling improbably across land that was, until recently, bare desert, lush hotel gardens, sprawling water parks, and the famous Dubai fountain shooting jets of water hundreds of feet into the dry desert sky, choreographed to music before crowds of tourists. To look at all this is to see a place that appears to be positively drowning in water, a land of endless, casual, watery abundance. And yet, this glittering surface conceals one of the most staggering contradictions on the planet. Because the United Arab Emirates is, in reality, one of the most water-scarce nations on Earth, a harsh desert with almost no natural fresh water to call its own. Beneath that shimmering, luxurious surface lies a genuine and deepening crisis, one that the country's wealth and engineering have managed to hide for decades. But the pressures are now mounting, the hidden costs are climbing, and the damage is spreading in places few people ever look. This is the water crisis concealed beneath the UAE's luxury surface, and this is the story of why it is becoming impossible to ignore. Let us begin with the hidden reality that the fountains and pools are designed to make you forget. The UAE possesses almost no natural, renewable fresh water. It has no permanent rivers. Its annual rainfall barely reaches 100 millimeters, among the lowest in the world. By every standard measure, it is a country that should not, by nature, be able to support anything like the population and the lifestyle it currently sustains. So where does all the water come from? The water in those fountains and pools and taps and golf course sprinklers. It comes from two main sources, and both of them, it turns out, are in serious and worsening trouble. Roughly 40% of the country's water is produced by desalination, the process of taking salt water from the sea and stripping the salt out to make it drinkable. And a slightly larger share, around 45% or so, is drawn up from underground aquifers, ancient reserves of groundwater buried beneath the desert. A small remainder comes from treated wastewater and the scant rainfall. The entire watery paradise, in other words, rests on just these two great pillars, desalination and groundwater. And understanding why both are failing is the key to understanding the crisis. Consider first the great engine of it all, desalination, the technology that more than anything else has made the modern UAE possible. Along the country's coastline sit enormous desalination plants that suck in seawater from the Persian Gulf by the millions of cubic meters and force it through energy-hungry processes that separate the fresh water from the salt. The scale is genuinely staggering. The UAE produces on the order of nearly 2 billion cubic meters of desalinated water every year, and the Gulf region as a whole, with more than 400 desalination plants, produces something like 40% of all the desalinated water on the entire planet. This technology is, without exaggeration, the lifeline of the nation. Without it, the cities could not exist in anything like their present form. But desalination carries a hidden price that is only now becoming fully apparent. And it is a price paid not just in money and energy, but in a slow, creeping damage to the very sea the water is drawn from. And that damage forms the heart of the crisis hiding beneath the surface. The energy dimension alone is sobering. Even the most efficient modern desalination plants consume a significant amount of electricity for every cubic meter of fresh water they produce. And when you compare that to the alternative of simply treating and reusing wastewater, desalination can require several times as much energy for the same volume of usable water. Multiply that across billions of cubic meters produced every year, running around the clock, every day, and the total energy appetite of the nation's water system becomes colossal. In a very real sense, the UAE spends a substantial portion of its abundant energy simply to manufacture the water its people cannot draw from the ground or the sky. This is a luxury that only an energy-rich nation could afford, and it is one of the reasons the crisis has remained hidden for so long. The country has been able to throw cheap, plentiful power at the problem, brute forcing an abundance of water into existence. But as the demand grows and the sea grows saltier, that energy bill only climbs. And the deeper the nation's water becomes entangled with its energy, the more vulnerable both become to any disruption in the other. Here is the problem that almost no one sees, because it happens underwater, out of sight. When a desalination plant separates fresh water from seawater, it does not make the salt disappear. It simply concentrates it. What is left behind is a substance called brine, a hyper-salty, super-concentrated soup of everything the process removed, laced with the various chemicals used to treat the water along the way. And there is a great deal of it. For every single liter of fresh drinking water a plant produces, it also generates roughly 1.5 liters of this toxic brine. The whey alone is estimated to produce around 1/5 of all the brine generated by desalination in the entire world. And all of that brine has to go somewhere. Overwhelmingly, it is pumped straight back out into the Persian Gulf. Now, if the Gulf were a vast, deep, open ocean, it might be able to absorb and disperse this endless stream of concentrated salt, but it is precisely the opposite. The Persian Gulf is shallow, reaching only about 100 meters at its deepest point, and it is a nearly enclosed body of water, connected to the wider ocean only through the narrow Strait of Hormuz. It flushes and mixes with the open sea extremely slowly, and it is already, by nature, one of the hottest and saltiest seas on Earth, with summer water temperatures climbing as high as 36 degrees Celsius. So picture what happens when you pump ever-increasing quantities of concentrated brine into a shallow, enclosed, already hyper-salty sea that barely mixes with the outside ocean. The salinity of the Gulf steadily climbs, and this is where the crisis reveals its most vicious and self-defeating quality. A trap of the country's own making, because the saltier the Gulf becomes, the harder and more energy-intensive it becomes to desalinate its water. The desalination plants are drawing in water that is growing progressively saltier, in part because of the very brine those same plants are pumping out. The solution to the water shortage is, quite literally, poisoning the source it depends upon, forcing itself to work ever harder to produce the same result. It is a snake devouring its own tail. And beyond this self-defeating spiral, the brine is doing real ecological harm, raising salinity and temperature and stripping oxygen from the water in ways that are toxic to marine life, contributing to the depopulation of local fish and crustacean species and threatening the Gulf's already fragile coral. The crisis is hiding, quite literally, beneath the surface of the sea. It is worth pausing on just how delicate the Gulf's marine ecosystem is, because it makes the brine problem all the more troubling. The corals of the Persian Gulf are already living at the very edge of what coral can endure, surviving in water hotter and saltier than corals almost anywhere else on the planet. They are, in a sense, nature's ultimate specialists, clinging to existence in conditions that would kill most of their relatives outright, but that also means they have almost no margin left. Studies have suggested that even a further temperature increase of 0.5 degree to 1 degree Celsius could push some of these coral species past their breaking point. The brine discharge, which is both saltier and often warmer than the surrounding sea, pushes precisely on these two variables, salinity and temperature, that the Gulf's marine life can least afford to have pushed. And the chemicals used in the desalination process, the anti-fouling agents and other treatment compounds, are discharged along with the brine, adding a further toxic burden to the water. The result is a slow degradation of the marine environment right along the coastlines where the plants cluster, an ecological cost paid quietly, out of sight of the tourists photographing the fountains, but real and accumulating nonetheless. The sea that gives the way its water is being subtly wounded by the very act of taking that water from it. Now turn to the second great pillar, the groundwater, and you find a crisis that is, if anything, even more advanced. Nearly half of the UAE's water is pumped up from underground aquifers, and much of this is what is known as fossil water, ancient reserves accumulated over thousands of years that recharge at a vanishingly slow rate, if at all. For decades, and especially to supply the country's thirsty agriculture, this groundwater has been extracted far faster than nature could ever replace it. The result is a steep and alarming decline. In some areas of the country, the water table, the level below which the ground is saturated with water, has been dropping by more than a meter every single year. The reserves are being mined toward exhaustion. But there is a second, crueler dimension to the groundwater crisis, one that mirrors the brine problem almost exactly. As the aquifers are drained and their internal pressure drops, seawater begins to seep inland, intruding into the emptying underground spaces, especially near the coast. This intrusion contaminates the remaining groundwater with salt, a process called salinization, gradually rendering it too salty to drink and eventually too salty even to irrigate many crops. So the depletion of the groundwater doesn't just reduce the quantity available, it degrades the quality of what remains, poisoning the reserve as it shrinks. And this, of course, forces the country to lean even more heavily on desalination, which in turn produces more brine, which further salinizes the Gulf. The two crises feed each other in an interlocking spiral. As if these compounding problems were not enough, there is a third factor pouring fuel on the fire, and it is a matter of sheer consumption. You might assume that a nation so acutely short of natural water would be exceptionally frugal in how it uses what it has. The reality is the exact opposite. The Gulf region has among the very highest rates of per-person water consumption anywhere in the world. The average resident of the region uses something on the order of 550 liters of water per day, compared to a global average of around 180 liters. That is roughly 3 times the world norm. And it is happening in one of the driest and most water-scarce places anywhere on the planet. Why? Part of the answer is the lavish lifestyle the water sustains, the swimming pools, the constantly irrigated lawns and golf courses, the water-intensive agriculture pushed into a landscape that is fundamentally hostile to it. And part of the answer is economics. Water in the UAE is heavily subsidized by the state, kept artificially cheap, which means that for the ordinary consumer, there is very little financial incentive to conserve it. The price at the tap does not reflect the enormous true cost in energy and environmental damage of producing that water. And so the most water-scarce region on Earth consumes water as if it were one of the most water-abundant, driving demand relentlessly upward even as the sources grow more strained. This subsidy question deserves a closer look because it sits at the heart of why the crisis has stayed hidden for so long. When a government heavily subsidizes the price of water, it is, in effect, deliberately concealing the true cost of that water from the people who use it. The resident filling a swimming pool or watering a lawn pays a price that bears almost no relation to the enormous expense in energy, in infrastructure, and in environmental damage of conjuring that water from the sea or pumping it from a dwindling aquifer. The gap between the price paid and the true cost is absorbed by the state, funded ultimately by the nation's oil wealth. For decades, this arrangement has worked to keep the population content and the illusion of abundance intact, but it has also removed the single most powerful tool for encouraging conservation, namely, a price that reflects reality. When water is cheap, people treat it as if it were plentiful, and the behavior that follows, the long showers, the lush gardens, the wasteful habits, deepens the very scarcity the subsidy conceals. It is a politically comfortable arrangement that quietly makes the underlying problem worse and unwinding it by raising prices to encourage thrift. Is precisely the kind of unpopular decision that governments are reluctant to make until a crisis forces their hand. The cheapness of the water is in a real sense part of the crisis itself. Wrapping around all of this is the ever-present dimension of energy and climate, which ties every strand of the crisis together into a single tightening knot. Desalination is enormously energy-intensive, requiring far more power than technologies like recycling wastewater. Historically, that energy has come overwhelmingly from burning fossil fuels, which release the greenhouse gases that drive global warming. And global warming, in turn, makes the entire water crisis worse in multiple ways at once. It raises temperatures, increasing evaporation and pushing up the demand for water. It heats the Gulf still further, and a hotter Gulf is not only more prone to the salinity problems already described, but is also physically harder to desalinate, because warmer, saltier feed water fouls the delicate membranes of the plants more quickly, demanding still more chemicals and still more energy. So the system burns energy to make water, which warms the planet, which heats and salts the sea, which makes the water harder to produce, which demands still more energy. It is another self-reinforcing loop, another spiral with no natural end, binding the water crisis to the climate crisis in an inescapable embrace. So why is all of this becoming impossible to ignore now, after decades in which the fountains kept flowing and the pools kept sparkling, and few outside the region gave it a second thought? The answer is that the pressures are all compounding at once, and the hidden costs are finally rising to the surface. The population continues to swell, heading from around 10 million toward 15 million and beyond, relentlessly increasing demand. The heat continues to climb, straining the whole system. The groundwater is approaching genuine exhaustion in places, while turning salty in others. The Gulf grows measurably saltier and hotter, degrading the very resource desalination depends on. The financial and environmental costs of simply maintaining the status quo mount higher every year. And recently, a new and sharp vulnerability has been thrown into stark relief: the strategic fragility of the desalination plants themselves. During recent regional conflict, water infrastructure in the Gulf came under direct threat, with reports of desalination facilities being struck or damaged, in some cases cutting off the water supply to entire communities. This laid bare a chilling truth that when a nation's water depends on a handful of large, coastal industrial plants, those plants become tempting targets, and the water security of millions can hinge on their protection. The crisis, in short, is no longer safely hidden. It is surfacing from every direction at once. In fairness, and this matters, the way is far from blind to these dangers, and it is responding with real seriousness, real money, and real ingenuity. The country is investing heavily in a range of solutions designed to ease the pressure. It is expanding the treatment and reuse of wastewater, recycling used water for agriculture, industry, and landscaping so that precious desalinated water is not squandered on golf courses. Currently, only around 40% of the region's wastewater is reused, but the potential to push that toward 90% represents an enormous, untapped opportunity. It is increasingly linking its newest desalination plants to solar power, chipping away at the fossil fuel dependence and the emissions that come with it. It is funding research into better brine management, from diluting the discharge to exploring technologies that could recycle the brine or extract valuable minerals from it rather than simply dumping it. It is experimenting with aquifer recharge, storing water underground for the future, and even with cloud seeding to coax more rain from the sky. And it has crafted national water strategies to coordinate all of these efforts, and look to models like Singapore, which has turned water recycling and conservation into a national art form through its celebrated multi-source water policy. These are genuine, substantive measures, and they show a country grappling intelligently and energetically with a problem it understands all too well. And yet, honesty compels a sober assessment of where all this leaves the country. The UAE has the wealth, the technology, and the determination to keep the water flowing for the foreseeable future. No one should imagine the taps running dry tomorrow, or the fountains falling silent next year, but keeping the water flowing is not the same as solving the crisis. Beneath the managed, comfortable surface, the fundamental problem is not being cured. It is being held at bay, at a cost that climbs relentlessly higher with each passing year. The vicious cycles remain firmly in place. The brine still salts the Gulf. The groundwater still salinizes as it drains. The energy demand still feeds the warming that worsens it all. The nation is running a treadmill that speeds up over time, forced to invest ever more energy, money, and engineering simply to stand still, simply to keep producing the same abundance from an environment growing steadily more hostile. That is the true meaning of a crisis becoming impossible to ignore. It is not that catastrophe has arrived, but that the effort and the cost and the mounting damage required to keep catastrophe at bay can no longer be hidden behind the dancing fountains. There is a larger lesson in all of this that reaches far beyond the borders of one wealthy desert nation, because the way is, in a sense, living in the world's future. As climate change dries out more regions of the planet, and as fresh water grows scarcer across much of the globe, more and more countries are turning, or will turn, to desalination as their salvation. The UAE and its Gulf neighbors are the leading edge of that global experiment, the place where the promise and the peril of engineering our way out of water scarcity are being tested first and most intensely. Their experience shows both sides of the ledger, with unusual clarity. On the one hand, it proves that it is genuinely possible to sustain a large, prosperous population in a place with almost no natural water, a remarkable achievement. On the other hand, it reveals the hidden costs, the ecological damage, the energy burden, the vicious cycles, the sheer relentless expense of doing so. The water crisis unfolding quietly beneath the UAE's glittering surface is, in miniature, a preview of the choices and the trade-offs that are warming. Thirsty world will increasingly have to confront, so the fountains still dance, and the pools still shimmer a brilliant blue, and the golf courses still glow an impossible green against the endless tan of the desert. On the surface, everything appears serene, abundant, conquered. The UAE has by any measure performed a genuine miracle in coaxing all this life and luxury from one of the most water-starved landscapes on Earth. But every miracle of this particular kind runs on a hidden and rising cost, and that cost is now beginning to break through the surface for all to see. Aquifers draining toward empty and turning to brine as they go, a shallow sea growing saltier and hotter with every liter of waste poured into it, an appetite for energy that warms the very world, making the water scarcer, and a vulnerability that a single well-aimed blow could expose. The question facing the UAE is no longer whether it can make fresh water bloom in the desert, for it has proven beyond doubt that it can. The real question, the one growing harder to avoid with each passing summer, is how long and at what mounting and hidden cost to the sea, to the climate, and to the future it can keep the beautiful illusion of endless abundance flowing. And that is a question the dancing fountains can no longer quite conceal.